In 71 BC, travelers on the Appian Way walked past 6,000 dying men. Every 100 feet, another cross. From Rome all the way to Capua, over 120 miles of human agony stretched along Rome's most important road. Some lasted days. The strong ones, the unlucky ones, lasted a week. Their bodies rotted in place for years, a monument to what happened when slaves dared to dream of freedom. This was Rome's answer to the greatest slave rebellion in its history. The crucifixion was merely the finale. Spartacus's final hours began not on a cross, but in a desperate charge across a blood-soaked battlefield, where a gladiator-general made one last attempt to kill the richest man in Rome. The Capuan gladiator slave who sparked the Third Servile War. Spartacus came from Thrace, the wild lands north of Greece, where the modern borders of Bulgaria and Turkey now meet. Ancient sources suggest he once served in the Roman army as an auxiliary, one of the non-citizen soldiers who filled Rome's ranks. Exactly how he ended up in chains remains unclear. Desertion, capture, some unnamed crime. What matters is where he landed, a gladiator school in Capua, about 25 miles north of modern Naples. The Ludus of Lentulus Batiatus was a prison disguised as a training facility. High walls ringed the compound. Armed guards watched the barracks. At night, heavy doors locked men inside cells. These weren't athletes preparing for competition. They were slaves being taught to die for entertainment. Most gladiators didn't retire. They bled out in the sand while crowds roared their approval, or they grew too old to fight and were disposed of like broken tools. Spartacus stood out. Ancient historians describe him as exceptionally tall and strong, a natural fit for the arena's brutal choreography. His military background gave him an edge most gladiators lacked. He understood formation, tactics, command. These skills would serve him far better than any Ludus instructor could have imagined. In 73 BC, about 200 gladiators in the Capuan school plotted escape. Someone talked. Word reached the guards. When discovery became imminent, roughly 70 men made their move before the full conspiracy could unfold. They seized whatever weapons they could find, kitchen knives, meat cleavers, cooking spits, nothing designed for combat, but enough. The makeshift weapons proved sufficient. The gladiators fought through their guards, seized several wagons loaded with proper gladiatorial equipment, and broke free into the Italian countryside. Once outside the walls, they needed leadership. The escapees chose 3 men to command them, 2 Gauls named Crixus and Oenomaus, and the Thracian called Spartacus. They fled to Mount Vesuvius. The volcano's slopes provided defensible ground, and word of the escape spread fast. Within days, other slaves began arriving. Field workers, household servants, anyone desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at freedom. What started as 70 armed men began swelling into something that terrified Rome. The initial Roman response was contemptuous. The Senate dispatched a force of 3,000 men under Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber to round up escaped slaves. Glaber positioned his troops at the base of Vesuvius and waited. The slaves were trapped on the mountain with no escape route. It should have been a simple siege. Spartacus made his first military decision. His men wove ropes from wild grapevines growing on the volcanic slopes and rappelled down an unguarded cliff face. The attack came from the direction the Romans never anticipated. Glaber's force was annihilated. The escaped slaves seized Roman military equipment, and suddenly they weren't just runaways, they were an army. Victory attracted more followers. Tens of thousands of slaves abandoned their masters and joined the rebellion. Spartacus led them north through Italy, defeating every force Rome sent against them. 2 Roman armies under the command of consuls were destroyed. The gladiator-general demonstrated tactical brilliance that rivaled Rome's finest commanders. For 2 years, he led his growing army up and down the Italian peninsula, winning battle after battle. By 72 BC, estimates put his forces at 70,000 to 120,000 people. Rome had a crisis. Rome mobilizes Crassus and the legions to crush the rebellion. The Senate's earlier dismissal turned to alarm. This wasn't brigandage. This was a full-scale revolt threatening Rome's very heartland. After 3 years of humiliation, they turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the wealthiest man in Rome, having made his fortune through real estate speculation, silver mines, and slave trading. He was also the only volunteer for the job. Everyone else understood the stakes. A war against slaves was considered dishonorable. Victory brought little glory. Defeat brought permanent shame. Crassus accepted command with 8 legions at his disposal, somewhere between 40,000 and 48,000 trained Roman infantry plus auxiliaries. He inherited 2 legions that had already fled from Spartacus under previous commanders. These men had tasted defeat, and Crassus knew fear could spread like disease through an army. He needed to establish one absolute truth in the minds of his soldiers: he was more dangerous to them than the enemy. Crassus revived an ancient punishment that had fallen into disuse: decimation. When one of his subordinates, Mummius, disobeyed orders and attacked Spartacus prematurely only to be routed, Crassus selected a cohort of 500 men from the defeated unit. They were divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. The soldier who pulled the marked lot was beaten to death with clubs by his 9 comrades. 50 men died that day, executed not by the enemy but by their own brothers in arms. The survivors received further punishment. They were fed barley instead of wheat, a humiliation that marked them as less than proper soldiers. They were forced to camp outside the main fortifications, exposed to potential enemy raids. In subsequent battles, these shamed men were placed at the front of the line, forced to prove their worth or die trying. The message reached every legionary in Crassus's army. Failure meant death at Roman hands, not enemy ones. The strategy worked through calculated brutality. Crassus pushed south, forcing Spartacus toward the toe of Italy. When the rebel army reached Rhegium near the Strait of Messina, Spartacus attempted to hire Cilician pirates to ferry 2,000 of his men to Sicily, hoping to incite another slave revolt there. The pirates took his payment and vanished, leaving the rebels trapped. Crassus built fortifications across the narrow isthmus, cutting off escape routes. His wall ran 35 miles across the peninsula, backed by ditches and ramparts. Spartacus was surrounded, with the sea behind him and Roman legions in front. Starvation became Crassus's weapon. He waited while supplies dwindled and desperation mounted. Spartacus made several attempts to break through the wall, losing thousands of men in failed assaults. Some tried building rafts to cross the strait, but Crassus had taken measures to prevent any passage to Sicily. The trapped rebels resorted to guerrilla raids, harassing Roman positions in the hope of creating an opening. Time was running out for Crassus as well. 2 other Roman commanders were approaching: Pompey, returning from Spain with his legions, and Lucullus, arriving from the east. If either reached the battlefield first, they would claim credit for ending the revolt. Crassus needed victory before the competition arrived. He intensified his attacks, pressing the rebels harder, forcing them toward a final confrontation. The final battle on the Silarus River, where Spartacus falls. By early 71 BC, Spartacus understood his position. The wall behind him could not be breached. Reinforcements were closing in to trap his army completely. His forces, though still numbering in the tens of thousands, were fracturing. Groups of men were breaking away from the main army to launch independent attacks against Crassus's legions. Discipline was collapsing. Unity was failing. Spartacus made his decision. He would turn and bring his full strength against Crassus in open battle near the Silarus River, in the region that would later be known as Lucania. The location is now identified near the modern Selle River. in an area that includes parts of Sinercia and Oliveto Citra. When the armies met, Spartacus attempted something extraordinary. He didn't aim to simply defeat the Roman legions. He aimed to kill Crassus himself. If he could strike down the Roman commander, the entire enemy force might collapse. He led a direct charge at the Roman center straight toward where Crassus commanded. It was a desperate gambit, but desperation was all that remained. The ancient sources record that Spartacus almost succeeded. He cut through the Roman lines, fighting his way toward the general. But the legions held. The press of bodies, the weight of numbers, the discipline that Crassus had beaten into his men through fear finally proved sufficient. Spartacus died somewhere in that chaos. Plutarch, Appian, and Florus all state he perished in the battle itself. His body was never found. Whether his men buried him in secret, whether the Romans threw him in a mass grave too mutilated to identify, or whether the sheer carnage of the battlefield simply swallowed him, no one knows. The scale of death was staggering. Ancient historians record that over 12,000 rebels died on the battlefield. Some sources suggest the number was far higher. The majority of Spartacus' army was annihilated in that single engagement. Those who fled the field scattered into the surrounding countryside, trying to escape the pursuing legions. About 5,000 fugitives were hunted down and killed by Pompey's forces, which arrived just as the battle concluded. Pompey sent word to the Senate, claiming he had ended the war, even though Crassus had won the actual fight. The political maneuvering over credit for the victory would fuel resentment between the two men for years. But 6,000 rebels were captured alive. For them, the true horror was just beginning. 6,000 crosses on the Appian Way, Rome's last warning. Roman law reserved crucifixion for slaves, violent criminals, and enemies of the state.